What's up, Freedom Warriors? I looked at the view count yesterday. It was like just over 100. I'm like, that's not too bad for a rinky-dink nobody like me. And then I looked at it this morning after I was answering a comment. I'm like, oh, it's almost at 500. That's insane. All right, so clearly there's an interest in this information. So I'm going to start to parse it down even more so we just laser focus in on some real essential topics. And the first little bit of this video is just going to be a refresher with respect to recap, if you will, of the first two videos, where we're just going to go through it in like 1 minute. Then we're going to get into this incorporation process. But before we can get into the incorporation process, incorporate it into what? Have you ever stopped to ask yourself that? Hey, bet you didn't. Let's get into this. All right, let's recap here. Essentially, the biggest topic to take away from the first two videos should be that the fact that there's this thing called legal personality. It exists. You have it. It's your property. And it's whether you're using it or someone's using it on your behalf, let's put it that way, it's getting used. So you have two choices. You can either start to recognize how it's created and how it's being manipulated on your behalf and seize control of it for yourself, and then start to operate that entity in law according to what you want rather than what the government wants. And really the big one is liberty. All of this stuff hinges on the very basic principle of liberty. Okay? So that was ground zero before the American Revolution and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and all of those great men basically understood this principle about freedom and liberty and stuff like that, of the individual, free from any sort of like social infrastructure like the monarchy or a government or something. Just men earning their way in the world by the sweat of their own brow, becoming successful or being destroyed through their own actions, by their own decisions and stuff. And surprisingly, it was the most prosperous in time for the Americas, and probably for humanity in general, as far as quality of life was concerned for the average person. You're always going to get squalor and everything else like that, and misery and disenfranchisement. But you know what I mean? If you were a person with a vision and a dream and stuff like that, then the sky's the limit kind of situation. And they absolutely seized upon that. And you can see it. That was effectively the birth of so many of the archetypes that we idolize, rightly or wrongly now, like the billionaire status, right? And just having unfathomable wealth and power and whatever else. And as we were being blinded and sort of like whatever, attracted by the bling bling over here, we lost sight of the truth of the liberty of the individual. And when that happened, they did the old sleight of hand thing. And basically they made you forget that there was an individual that had a full legal capacity at all. And then all that remained was this civil statutory creature that was now controlled by rules and regulations instituted by whatever government happened to be arbitrarily ruling in the day. So you have a slow decay, if you will, from the 1920s, the highest point really of the American society, sliding down to where we are at a low point right now, essentially in the 2020s. 100 years later, doesn't take long, eh? And the way to sort of like turn that around is to seize your own power and to educate yourself. You'd be surprised at how much more peaceful life is when you have peace of mind and understanding and knowledge as a weapon to wield at your disposal when something like this gets thrown in your lap. And usually what happens is when the government's like, oh, we want money or this, that, or some other bad news ends up getting to you, we panic because we don't know what to do. We don't understand the system or anything else like that. We're just like naked in the woods. And these videos essentially are designed to sort of remove that, that newbiness, if you will, and sort of instill in you a bit of iron and be like, I can do this. And then just basically institute a few steps exercising human rights and making a legal argument is not that difficult. But if you don't actually understand the basic principle of liberty, or that there is a legal person attached to you in the free democratic society, which is what we're going to talk about today, well, you're not going to get very far with your legal argument, are you? It starts with liberty, and then it moves from liberty into the idea that there's recognition that I can either be this or this. And then those two things are now true because they operate in this bigger thing over here, which we're going to talk about right now, called the Free Democratic Society. So do not skip over doing a hell of a lot of research on the concept, legally, the doctrine, if you will, of liberty. And then dive in afterwards on your, whatever country you're from, find out how the mechanism of legal personhood works. Okay, and you'll find them, and I'm going to show you today with respect to how it works in Canada. But of course, these are going to be true for almost any country that's been signed on to the international covenants, because they basically standardize the rules for the most part. There'll be a few subtle changes here and there, but it's a lot of legwork, but it's got to get done. So let's get into the Free Democratic Society. All right, the first thing we got to talk about before we get into the Free Democratic Society is this court case here, Solomon v. Solomon. It happened in 1897 in the UK. Essentially, this guy, Aaron Solomon, he was running a leather business, probably as a sole proprietor. He incorporated his business as a limited liability company, okay, and then he transferred all of his interests through it, okay, as a director, as a secured creditor, the whole 9 yards. And when the company went belly up, he basically rolled it all up and pinned it on the corporation and walked away scot-free. And when the creditors, or whatever, the liquidators, basically sued him, the courts agreed that they were two separate legal entities, and so he couldn't be held responsible for the debts. And I'm pretty sure they did that on purpose because they were reverse engineering it. Look at what they're really saying here is that the human being here, this Aaron Solomon, and the legal entity that he incorporated, right, his business, are two separate entities in law and could be assigned, various levels of liability. And two, and more importantly, is that the incorporated entity was now responsible for dealing with the debts that were left behind by the human beings. So you could reverse engineer that and be now these duties, responsibilities, and obligations could be laid at the feet of the incorporated entity, and then basically say, well, you're the incorporated entity. If you didn't argue it otherwise in court, then it would be true. You see, this guy went to court and he said, nah, I'm not the incorporated entity. That's something else. And the court agreed with him, and he walked away without having to give back any of the money. And there it is. Okay. So that's a very important legal judgment, because it set precedent essentially with the courts to be like, the liability of the incorporated entity attached to a human being is different than the liability required upon the human being. Okay. So these things they're not directly equivalent. You can lay debts and responsibilities and obligations and all the rest of that stuff at the feet of an incorporated entity, and nothing will happen if you don't take recognition. And that's exactly what Mr. Solomon did. And good for him kind of situation. And so, of course, I believe the court sensed that opportunity. And then all of a sudden, here you can see in the Shipping Act 1916 from the United States, they're starting to use things like the term person includes corporation. The exact reverse engineering I was talking about. If you're a corporate entity and you're a person, essentially you're now responsible for all of the duties, obligations, and responsibilities that we're about to outline in the Shipping Act 1916. But you have to be the person. Okay? And there it is. Okay, and of course you can see that carried on all the way up to 2025. This is from Canada's Interpretation Act 1985. There's the person again, includes a corporation. So they established the precedent in 1897. They started using that language in the early 1900s, and it still exists all the way up until today. And that person is the person that is controlled by the Free Democratic Society. So you're looking at this new section here on the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms under Section 1 here, the last little bit of the sentence. In a free democratic society, that's where this person exists. Okay? And it's a legal entity, and that legal entity has status, standing, and capacity. And it varies depending on his status. So if you're a real lowly person, the driver, you barely have any authority at all, and you're subject to all the rules and penalties. But if you go in there as a human being, as a natural person or something like that, well, you have all the power, and the government has none of the power because you have absolute rights and they don't. But it all stems, in my opinion, from this judgment, Solomon v. Solomon. So it'd be worth checking it out and read a few sort of like summaries of it and get some other people's legal perspective on what it is that they're talking about. You'd be surprised at how you can reverse engineer some of these legislative ideas when you're starting to look at where potentially they could have stemmed from. And this is a very famous case, so I'm pretty sure that's why it's famous. All right, so let's move into the next section here. All right, getting into the Constitution Act 1867, we'll start really taking apart this free democratic society idea. Essentially, you can see in part 2 here, union, that in 1867, they basically said a whole bunch of provinces in Canada would be formed into one union under the name Canada, okay? And the executive power and control over that entity, Canada, if you will be vested in the king or the queen. And you can see that down there in part 3, executive power. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds antithetical to freedom. It's like, okay, we're just going to seize this entire landmass. We're going to enslave the entirety of the people of it. And we're going to claim that we now have executive power and control over top of them for reasons X, Y, Z. I don't care what the reasons are. And then they went as far as to grant themselves power and authority under Section 91 here, where you can see that now, notice this word here, the classes of subjects. Now listen, subjects here, I'm pretty sure they're talking about subjects to the king, subjects to the queen. You know what I'm saying? Enslaved. You are beneath this person. And they're talking about classes because they gave themselves the right to create laws for like systems of taxation under 3 here. So what they're saying is the class of subject with respect to taxation is the resident. The class of subject with respect to, say, unemployment insurance is the employee, right? The class of subject, if you will, with respect to the banking corporation or whatever it is like, you know, the bank manager or whatever it is, you know what I'm saying? Like these classes here, these are these legal persons we've been talking about. And you saw spring up essentially now from the Solomon judgment, right? So the Solomon judgment gave rise to the idea that you could now create a legal entity and assign it duties, obligations, and responsibilities, and then pin that legal entity onto an actual human being and make the claim that that human being now is responsible for those things without telling them that essentially it's a choice. So they make you believe that you have to pay taxes, but what they fail to do is educate you to tell you that it's more of a choice. It's more like, you know, free will kind of situation, right? They can't compel you. They have a lot of ways to coerce you, but that's just it. Since they've gotten this far down the garden path, that just leaves the door wide open for you to launch a lawsuit against them and just absolutely destroy them because their guilt is beyond reproach. They can't really say, oh, no, well, we aren't responsible for that. So that right there is the Free Democratic Society. They created this Constitution Act in Canada in 1867 as the 14th Amendment in the United States, and I'm sure it's going to be the same for a lot of different places. It's the same structure in Australia. I was talking to a guy last year about this stuff in Australia. They have the exact same sort of scenario there with their Constitution Act. And the thing is like these are based around classes of subjects and not the individual in their full legal capacity, because a person in their full legal capacity doesn't have to pay taxes. So this is a prime example of the execution of arbitrary power, right? So arbitrary power is the authority to act in any manner a person sees fit without being guided or restricted by any law. And you see this all the time with police officers to just go absolutely insane. You can get power drunk, you know what I mean? And they just start power tripping, and they're not following the law anymore. They're just making stuff up as they go, and they don't care, right? So that's a classic example of arbitrary power, and this is a much more sophisticated here. This Section 91 is a much more sophisticated version of arbitrary power. So it's time to get into the next section here, where we're going to talk about now the breaking of this arbitrary power paradigm for the introduction of human rights that would take place in 1982. All right, here we all are living under arbitrary power, right? We basically are under the thrall of the government. They're telling us what we can do. They're writing laws. We can't opt out. We can't exercise any human rights. Life just sucks. And then eventually one day in 1976, they're like, we were just done with that system. Let's do something new. And that's exactly what they do. And so they incorporate the international covenants from international law into domestic law, granting people something called absolute rights. And so what you can see is the bifurcation. They're trying to keep the old system of arbitrary power in place, but at the same time now add this new element, which is the ability for the individual to access their human rights by way of the international covenants and the Constitution, to petition a court of competent jurisdiction to defend them against incursions by the state. Okay, so if you look at the preamble here from the international covenants, you can see in this one particular paragraph here that they're talking about free human beings enjoying civil and political freedoms, right? Free from fear and want. And that it's, working towards conditions that will essentially let them live their best life, right? But then notice down here at the paragraph near the bottom where it says, they also realized that the same individual, notice in the first paragraph, they're talking about human beings. And now all of a sudden they've switched over to the individual has duties to other individuals and to the community for which he belongs. So they're talking about different characters in law here, aren't they? Different classes of subjects. In this case, they're talking about a human being. And the other one, they're talking about an individual. Well, those are two clearly different things. And you can see that. The human family, the human person. What does that mean? Right? The human person, human being and person put together. So what do you think that means? That means the human being who takes on legal personhood. Okay, that's what that means. The inherent dignity, therefore. And that's where the natural person comes into it, right? That second paragraph there is actually a lot more important than most people understand. But you see the preamble basically laying out the plan, the master plan, if you will, to be like, okay, they're free human beings that can kind of do what they want as long as they don't hurt anybody else, and they play within the rules, right, of normal society. But we got to sort of like try to keep, the status quo. So we're going to allow this free democratic society to exist and whatnot, and continue to allow the states to make laws and stuff like that. And even to a certain degree, violate people's rights, because their process is by way of attrition. If you don't call them out on their naughtiness, they're not going to change. That's basically accepted. Okay. So I know that sucks. So the preamble here is setting up the groundwork, if you will, for absolute rights. Okay. Absolute rights here are essentially fundamental human rights that cannot be limited or infringed under any circumstances, even during an emergency. If you read the third paragraph of the preamble of the Emergencies Act, 1985, you're looking at it here, you can see them state the exact same thing, which comes from, of course, Article 4 here. Even in times of public emergency, you can see that 4.2, there's a no derogation clause, which says Articles 6, 7, 8. So 6 is the inherent right to life. 7 is free from medical experimentation, inhuman treatment, and all that good stuff. 8, 1 and 2 are both slavery and freedom from slavery and servitude. 11 is Which one is that? Oh, that's the right not to be imprisoned for your failure to keep up a contract. That would be important if you're fighting off a child support situation where they're like, we're going to throw you in jail because you haven't kept up with child support. 15, I can't remember which one that is. 16, obviously recognition as a person before the law. 18 is the freedom to express your religion and whatnot. So Article 4 here basically lays out some of your rights. But I also included Article 3 here because I want you to notice how important this article is, especially with respect to the exercising of the absolute rights. It says the state parties to the present covenant undertake to ensure not only the equal right of men and women, notice again the class of subject they're talking here, the player in law, men and women now, not individuals, not persons, men and women, human beings, to the enjoyment of all civil and political rights. Notice they have to undertake to ensure that we have equal rights and that we can enjoy them. Those two things right there are incredibly powerful tools to use in your legal argument to compel the courts to force the state to basically do what you want, because they've already basically taken on the responsibility under Article 3. They already said that they would do it. They undertake. That's what that means. We take on the responsibility to do this. Very important, right? And of course, you get into Article 5 here, which says that with respect to limitations on the other rights, those limitations have to be expressly laid out in the covenants themselves. Otherwise, you can't create laws or engage in any activity that would destroy access or the use of any of the rights. And you can't limit the right to a greater extent than is provided for in the covenant. Okay, so I know there's a lot there, but basically what they're saying is if the covenant doesn't allow you to do something, you can't do it, which means there are a whole bunch of other rights, like the right to self-determination. There's no limitation there. Obviously, there's no limitation. And even though it doesn't fall under Article 4.2 here, the fact of the matter is it's an absolute right. You have the absolute right to determine what you're going to do with your own life. The end. Okay, so that's very important, which gets into the situation now. All of a sudden, if we're starting to incorporate absolute rights into the regular law, you can see that they made an amendment to the Constitution Act 1867, most likely Section 91, by adding Section 52 here from the Constitution Act 1982, which is when we actually incorporated the international covenants into law in Canada. Section 52 invalidates the statutory authority. You can see it says that any law that is inconsistent with the Constitution, to the extent of the inconsistency, is of no force or effect, meaning it doesn't actually apply to you anymore. Done. Section 52 invalidates the authority granted to the government. They granted to themselves, I guess you could say, under Section 91, and that is to comply with this idea that you have absolute rights. Okay? And the thing is those absolute rights are now conflicting, if you will, with respect to Article 2 here, where the state has the right to apply to all individuals subject to its jurisdiction laws. Okay, that's what Article 2 subsection 1 is saying. You know what I mean? They're basically telling you, even though they're like, oh no, yeah, you have all of these rights and then they can't discriminate against you, what they are really saying is that you're subject to their jurisdiction. That's what they're saying, of course, right? So moving into the next thing is that all of a sudden the Section 91 there had to be effectively clarified, because people started asking questions about the absolute rights in the 80s, okay, after they signed on in 76. So the Canadian Supreme Court was forced to come out and clarify that the Canada that they're talking about in Section 91 is not Canada as a geographical unit, but as the juristic federal unit, okay, which means a corporate entity. It's not the landmass they're talking about, Canada. They're talking about the juristic person, in this case, Canada, which is a corporate entity. And therefore, corporate entities cannot exercise power and control over an individual standing on their constitutional rights in their full legal capacity that have absolute rights. And there it is, okay? They're telling you straight out in 1980 that the Canada they're talking about in the Constitution Act that apparently grants them the authority to make all these rules and regulations for the, the peace, order, and good governance of Canada, is all based around a corporate entity and have nothing to do with the actual physical landmass. So do you actually have to be incorporated into this federal juristic unit? No, of course not. And that's where you start getting into the idea of incorporation into the free democratic society. It happens without your actual knowledge. It's through citizenship and stuff like that, and a couple other little tools. But ultimately, that right there basically starts to explain how absolute rights start to upset the apple cart, if you will, with respect to how the government operates. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next section here, where we start to look at these rights that aren't absolute and how they're limited and stuff like that comparably, and how to start to interpret the covenants and whatnot to determine whether a right is absolute or not. All right, let's do it. All right, along with absolute rights, you have statutory rights that are granted to you under the moniker of citizenship. It means you can vote. It means you have the right to peaceful assembly. You have the right to freedom of association. These freedoms are all covered under Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but essentially all of those rights can be limited by Section 1, and you see that here because in the free democratic society, the covenant basically gives the government the authority to limit those rights. You can see here under Article 21, again, notice, which are necessary in a democratic society. That's the terminology they like to use to be like, we can now limit the right. The right of peaceful assembly can be limited due to national security, public safety, public order, protection of public health. You might, the trucker convoy, I'm looking at you. You guys should have basically seen that one coming. Applying under Section 2 rights to defend your interests was silly. Should have went under 7. Anyways, you can see it's also true with respect to Article 22. You have the right to the freedom of association, if you will, but the freedom of association can be restricted again for all of these reasons, X, Y, Z. So you can see the operation of law in the covenants, and then you can see it directly expressed right here in Section 2 of the Constitution Act 1982, and you can see the limitation. Instead of them basically saying it for what it is in the actual covenant, they've just done a catch-all kind of situation by adding Section 1 here that says that we can prescribe limitations, and that's just it. You can see under Article 22 here, subsection 2, you can see here, no restrictions may be placed on the exercise of this right other than those which are prescribed by law. Now, I was messing around with the landlord-tenant board stuff again, and look at what I saw here under the definitions section. Prescribed means prescribed by regulations. Same word. So what they're really telling you here is this Article 22 here is this: whenever they prescribe a law, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about this idea that this prescribed process, it comes from the fact that this regulation gives them the authority to do that based around, the tenant or the person or whoever else it is. And they can actually deem you to be that person. They can prescribe you to be a person if you don't challenge it. So you're just seeing, again, this mirroring of the actual sort of the legal processes. They tell you that they can prescribe it by law with respect to putting limitations on stuff. And then all of a sudden you see this very operation of law working in a piece of a legislative enactment, the Residential Tenancies Act, where they're telling you they have the power to basically limit the statutory creature, in this case, the tenant and the landlord. Done. Right? So the thing is like, you have to be very careful. I'm going to bring up Article 12 here. This is the freedom of movement, if you will. And notice this one here: everyone lawfully, everyone, this means all persons. Sorry, I just clicked on my own little slide there. I went backwards. It means all persons lawfully within the territory, okay? Meaning natural persons all the way down to the lowliest statutory creature. That's everyone, okay? So it can mean human beings and everyone in between, either alive or in law, Okay, shall have the right to liberty of movement. Notice there, it doesn't say freedom of movement. It says the liberty of movement there. I told you that word liberty. It has a lot more meaning than you think. Okay, and the freedom to choose its residence. It says everyone shall be free to leave any country, including his own. And notice here 3, the above mentioned rights, that's the part I want you to understand, shall not be subject to any restrictions except the restrictions we're about to give you. But notice here under 4, it says no one shall be arbitrarily deprived of the right to enter his. Notice the term there, his, that pronoun. They're talking about a man. Okay, no man can be arbitrarily deprived of his right to enter his own country. Notice that the restriction here on Article 12 only applies to 1 and 2, and 4, it has no restriction upon it. So that's how you can start to recognize immediately the nature of an absolute right. You can absolutely, as long as you're in good standing and have documentation to prove that you're a resident of the country and stuff like that, meaning you live there, not the statutory designation, you can absolutely walk across the border. You don't have to fill out any paperwork or tell the government anything. You can just walk right in and that's it. And they can't stop you. Done. Okay, so you can start to see also, of course, is when they started to synergize these documents, they started to incorporate this stuff from the international covenants directly into domestic law, which is where the Constitution starts to get a little muddled. Right, so you see Article 9 here, the right to liberty and security of the person. Of course, Article 6 is the inherent right to life. And you're seeing those here now being reflected under the legal rights, okay, where Section 7 has them all rolled up for you. And you can see that they can't be deprived except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. It's not with respect to Section 1. In fact, the courts in Canada have ruled many, many times that Section 1 is basically completely, almost totally ineffectual at nullifying any rights granted to you under Section 7, because Section 7 rights apply to human beings and Section 1 limitations apply to statutory creatures. Nails it, right? So that right there is a huge one. You can start to see this synergy between this flow from the international covenants into domestic law. If you look for these sort of connections, I think that you'll be very surprised at how powerful that can be and persuasive with respect to your argument. That's why I'm showing you this sort of flow of the Article 9 being written here in the international covenant, and then that being adopted into Canadian law under Article 7. And you can even go back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and see everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the security of the person, going all the way back to that document, because you can be like, this idea came in mid-1940s and has existed all the way up until today. So it's pretty hard for the courts to be like, oh no, you don't have the right to life, liberty, and blah, 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 you know what I mean? So that's why it's important to show this very long progression where the courts have accepted for an incredibly long time, that we have rights that supersede statutory authority that existed long before the government ever existed. And now, of course, Section 26 here, we talked about it. This is how you can access all the other rights, okay? Like the one where you can enter your country without actually having to, jump through 40 hoops of fire and stuff like that, or get patted down by the TSA people and all the rest of that stuff. Yeah. The fact of the matter is that that's where Section 26 comes into play. And of course, that's the 9th Amendment in the United States. There's going to be one probably with respect to, if you don't have one, then you can just go to the court and be like, under the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights, the government didn't keep up with its responsibility to create legislation or processes or applications, if you will, to challenge their authority. And that's in and of itself a violation of human rights. Okay, so that's why Section 26 becomes incredibly important. It is the gateway to allow you to access all of these absolute rights that may or may not show up in the Constitution. Okay, and last but not least here, I want to show you this. I want to sort of get back to the legal person here for a sec. And I mentioned it a few times in this video, and I just want to show you it again. If you look at the definition of a person here under the Residential Tenancies Act, okay, it says an expression referring to a person means an individual, sole proprietorship, partnership, limited partnership, trust, or corporate body, or an individual in his or her capacity to play the role of a trustee, executor, administrator, or other legal representative. Notice that one, or other legal representative. So they're basically leaving the door wide open there. But my point being here is, again, notice this word, his and her, right after individual. Well, you don't see that after person. You could go through this entire document, look at every time they use the word person, and you will never find the word his and her afterwards. This is the kind of stuff you need to look for in your legislation to understand about absolute rights and the free democratic society and all the rest of that stuff. This individual here, they're the entity in law that has absolute rights. This person up here, they don't. They have limited rights because they can be forced into the capacity of recognition as a trustee, executor, administrator, body corporate, a limited partnership, a trust. Okay? So that's why it's incredibly important to understand that the free democratic society in and of itself is a collection of statutory creatures, persons, not human beings. Okay? And those statutory creatures are controlled by statute. And therefore, if you choose not to be recognized, because you don't have to, because you have the right to recognition as a person, and you have the right to self-determination under 1 and 16 of the international covenants, then that's the end of it. And you have the right to be free of servitude, obviously. And I'll leave it at that. Go look up your oath of citizenship and see what it says. Go look up the word allegiance, what that means in a law dictionary. And I think you'll start to understand where the servitude thing comes in. Remember, when you're born, you become a citizen, and then all of a sudden that becomes the predominant legal moniker, meaning you're always in a diminished capacity. So until you basically rise to the level of individual exercising their full legal capacity as a natural person, you will never be able to attain this his and her capacity. You'll always be viewed as a diminished sort of legal entity, as a body corporate. And then, of course, you'll be completely enslaved to the free democratic society. It sounds like a warm and fuzzy little term to be like, oh, this is so nice, the free democratic society. But what it really is a prison. It's a hell and it's a prison. It's a hell run by psychotic individuals. And I think you can see that with respect to the kind of shenanigans that went on over the past 4 years, where these people just made absolutely ridiculous decisions pertaining to how they thought they could encroach on people's lives. So that should sort of cover some of the raw basics of the free democratic society. You have this legal infrastructure that's attached to the physical country, if you will, that you live in, that now the state parties can create laws, rules, and regulations, usually under some sort of Constitution Act, 1867, the 14th Amendment, pick it, and basically make laws and claim some sort of dominion over you. But the truth of the matter is you have absolute rights that you can exercise, and those rights allow you to opt out of any obligation, duty, or responsibility to the legal entity and remove you from any power and control that the state might try to exercise over top of you. Right. So next week, we're going to look into the actual process of incorporation, how they do that in law. So now that you understand the legal person and now you understand the free democratic society, both basically fictitious elements of the law that exist only in the mind but have real world repercussions. And now you'll see how the government basically goes through the process of usurping your property and operating it on your behalf. Thank you so much for joining me. Get studying. Keep your nose to the grindstone. You'll be surprised. At first it's hard, But as long as you keep up with it, it gets a lot easier. And then all of a sudden you hit a critical mass and you just become incredibly knowledgeable and fluent in this material. And then you're pretty much untouchable. So we'll see you in the next one.